Today's guest is Ted Neward. He's a principal at Neward Associates and most recently the director of tech culture at Rocket Mortgage. He's also a guest lecturer for the iSchool at the University of Washington Information School, which I think is interesting as well. I love education and giving back to educational organizations. So Ted, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. It's lovely to be here.
So for those who haven't met you, talk a bit about your background. Where are you from? Who are you? And what do you do?
Well, hi, my name is Ted Neward. I like long walks in the rain and pina coladas. Background, actually a little bit different than a lot of folks that you'll see in this space, in that my degree from the University of California at Davis is in international relations. I'm not a CS major. I crashed a couple of CS classes in college, but other than that, I've had no formal CS education. I've written, I think my name is on like a dozen different books and several hundred articles, and I've done a lot of presentations and stuff since. And currently I reside in Redmond, Washington, about 10 minutes from the Microsoft campus. So, and I tend to study a lot of stuff, as you can kind of tell. And there's another bookshelf up there and another one down there. And let's not even talk about my Kindle. Holy crap. It's a good thing those things are like free to carry around. Now, I spend a lot of time thinking about technology. I spend a lot of time thinking about how to manage technology teams. And I spend a lot of time thinking about philosophy. As a matter of fact, my sort of self-appointed title is computational philosopher, because I think we don't do enough of that. And I think there is a really interesting intersection of psychology, philosophy, and programming. Sci-Phil-Prog is what I call it.
Oh, that's very interesting. I like that. I have to think more about that. I can see where you're going with that, though. That's very interesting.
Well, I mean, debugging, right? What did I know and when did I know it and how do I know it's right? I mean, so much of that is core philosophical questions. And the thing that is funny, just on a quick tangent, most of the time you tell people that you're interested in philosophy and they roll their eyes and they're like, oh my gosh. But so much of the time, the reason why people get annoyed with philosophers is philosophers aren't as interested as much with answers as they are with questions.
Right.
And that offends people in some fundamental ways. Give me the answers. No. The questions are more interesting. I hate you. Anyway.
That is interesting. That is very true. So, all right, let's just rewind the clock a little bit. And you said what? International affairs?
International relations. Yep.
Relations. So what did you do with that degree after you graduated?
Well, mostly I hid it on my resume, because the question I kept getting in interviews was, how does an IR degree relate to being a professional developer? I mean, what happened in college was, when I graduated high school, I kind of wanted to be, Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan. I wanted to be the intelligence analyst who was looking at the various pieces of intelligence that were coming in and trying to figure out just what in the hell Vladimir Putin is thinking about this week. But I moved in with a couple of roommates, one of whom his dad was an IBM research fellow. And I realized about halfway through my junior year that I was actually much more interested in programming than I was in some of the IR stuff. And I was talking with Jesse, and he said, you realize, you don't really need a CS degree. And back in the, mid 90s, that was very, very much the case. As long as you knew how to write code, people would hire you. And I hadn't realized that until I met Jesse and started talking with him. And he's like, oh yeah. Just get a degree. People like to see that you've got a degree, but they don't care what it's in. His degree was actually in comparative literature, because that was the degree that required the fewest credits to graduate. He literally went through and looked at all the numbers and said, this one, that's my degree.
I love it.
And so about middle of my junior year, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, let's pivot. Let's do this. I don't want to start over, for crying out loud. Let me just graduate and get out of here. But I did exactly that. I graduated in 1995. Tells you about, this is not just a reflection of the light off the cabinets, kids. This is gray hair right here. And got started at that time doing C++ Windows development. I actually, one of the very first jobs I had, I was working for Mike Cohn, who some people may recognize as Mountain Goat Software, one of the big Scrum guys.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike and I had some very interesting conversations. You know, this was before he was well known for his stuff in the Scrum space. And once I got that, you know, first role, then it was, okay, cool. You've done this before. You've worked for a year for a company. We don't really care what your degree was in, as long as you can sling code.
Right.
And then, you know, really didn't talk about it again until probably 15 years later, when I started realizing that my international relations degree prepared me for the programming industry better than a computer science degree does.
Mm.
And I actually have a talk that I keep waiting for some conference to actually be bold enough to select. It is why my international relations degree is better than your computer science degree. Yeah, that's going to be a fun one to deliver somewhere as a keynote. I guarantee it.
Well, as somebody with a computer science degree, I am not offended by that, because I sometimes think, why did I do that? I don't even use any, I hardly use any of it.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
crazy.
And that's really the thing is the liberal arts, you know, everybody is kind of panning the liberal arts in favor of STEM, right? STEM, we got to do STEM, we got to do STEM. STEM will get you a job today, but it's not going to teach you how to think. It's not going to teach you the concepts of, and in many respects, where a lot of people really struggle, it seems, is how to have some of that higher order, you know, thinking mechanism, how to think in systems, for example, how to reason about what's going to go on. I mean, you know, I'll give you an example. When we start talking about, you know, open source and governance of open source projects, that's political science right there.
Yep.
Literally, where do we want the representation to be? How do we want this group to self-govern? You know, who do we want to have the ability to, you know, log jam or block some of the things to go on? These are all the very basic things that we discussed in political science. And if you're thinking about doing a startup, well, then a background in economics is really, really helpful, right? And so on and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So, you know, I will absolutely lay my IR degree down against anybody's computer science degree. Once we also clear the caveat that, you know, a lot of people inside of IR, part of what you have to do is learn how to learn. And that is the one skill that computer science folks, in many cases, really desperately need when they come out of college. And it's not a thing that CS typically teaches. You know, they tend to say, oh yeah, computer science, it's kind of a solved problem. Learn this language, learn these algorithms, you're good to go. You know, no, it's not. Any professor who says that is absolutely, you know, should be fired. So
yeah, that's a really interesting point. There was one small company I worked for many years ago, when we would hire people right out of college. Some of it's because, of course, they're cheaper labor, and some of it's most of it, though, was because we were trying to catch him and say, oh, yeah, we don't even care what language you learned in school. Here's what you're going to do for us. Jump on board. And some could do it. Some couldn't ever make that leap. And they probably aren't going to make it in technology, because you're going to have to do that leap fairly often. And you're right. You need those people who want to be, I want to constantly learn. I want to constantly hone my skill. I want to constantly figure out what's the next thing, because technology's always got the next thing. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. You also really want people who are comfortable with answers that are not 1 or 0, right?
That's so
CS
true.
really teaches a binary style of thinking, and that works when you're talking about, you know, bits, but it doesn't work when you're talking to users and when you're thinking about architecture and when you're thinking about patterns and so forth. There are lots of different ways that you could write code to solve a particular problem. But a lot of kids in CS are like, okay, but tell me the right answer, right? And then they graduate and then they go to work, and instead of tell me the right answer, it becomes tell me the best practice, right? A kid, there is no such thing as best practices, period, full stop. It's time for you to understand that the world is neither black nor white, but it's this constant shade of gray. Used to it. And that's a hard lesson for some folks to learn, particularly if they were really thriving in that academic environment where things are either right or wrong.
Right. So how did you choose C++? I mean, there are a lot of languages that are vibrant and around at that time. What made you pick that? So that was it to get this particular job, or?
Well, so the interesting thing there is, I had back in high school, I had a friend of mine who he was, I mean, if I was the self-taught programmer, he was the self-taught programmer professor. I mean, he was just ridiculously brilliant. And he had copies of Borland's Turbo Pascal and Borland's Turbo C. And I dinked around with C for a little bit, but I'll tell you, man, pointers just kicked my butt. I just could not wrap my head around pointers at all. So I punted on C and wrote some code in Pascal because, hey, it's fun.
Yeah.
And then when I got to college and I started tinkering with some other stuff, I picked up C again, and this time pointers started to make more sense. And in particular, when I moved in with these two guys, Jesse was all in on C++, and yeah, okay, why not? We actually, his big thing was we need to have code that you can show people. If you don't have the degree, you have to have what we would now call a portfolio, right? Today it would be, here's your GitHub profile, but back then you didn't have a server where you could point to all your code. So he actually wanted to work on a game, popular board game at the time called Supremacy, which is kind of like Risk, but add in economics and nuclear weapons.
Oh, nice.
And you could support up to 6 players with it. And so we wanted to actually do a BBS friendly version of Supremacy where we could have like 5 phone lines coming into the apartment, and so 5 of our friends could dial in, and because we could never find 6 people to all sit down at the same time in this place to do this. And so that's when we started working with Borland's Object Windows library. And being at the university, you could pick up Borland C++, and people just don't understand, right? You probably do, but the box for Borland C++ was like yay, it was huge, big, because it was 98% manuals, right? I mean, printed manuals, kids. Oh, and a stack of floppies about 25 high. Right. And I mean, this was a multi-$1,000 purchase that you could get at the bookstore for $50, right? And so, yeah, if you're going to learn something that everybody's really, really, really excited about. And, I worked at the bookstore, so I could go and get a copy of Strup's Gray Edition, 2nd edition, right? C++ programming, second, and pick up the ARM reference book, the annotated C++ reference manual, the ARM, and a couple of other books. And I just, dove into this so significantly. And then crashed a couple of CS classes and was absolutely stunned that, not only did I know more C++ than all of my classmates, but I actually knew about as much or more than the professor, and at that point I was lost. I mean, I just, whatever hope there was for me was gone, because I loved this and people were excited about it. And, I crashed a programming languages class where the 4 of the 10 weeks were on C++. The professor is talking about, somebody was asking, well, when would you want to use exception handling as opposed to an error return code? And he's like, I'm not entirely sure. And from the back of the room, I kind of do one of these. Is like, did you have another question? I'm like, no, I was going to answer that one. And all the heads swivel, right? They all look back at me. And I'm like, well, because exceptions will continue to propagate upwards unless you explicitly handle it. So it's actually a better way to make sure that errors get handled. And everybody looks back at the professor and he goes, that seems reasonable. Continues on with his lecture. But at the end of the class, bell rings, he just does one of these. And I thought, oh, crap. But I mean, when you've got that, when you've spent some time learning that particular language and very clearly it's valuable like that, yeah, you're gonna dive into it head first in many respects. So I mean, there were some other stuff we played around with, languages that a lot of people today wouldn't even recognize. TCL/TK. Did you ever play around?
Oh, I've heard of it. I have never played with it, but I've heard of
it. And what else? Well, there was one class that tried to do things in Perl, but You can't really do anything in Perl. You can only hack your way to some level of it doesn't crash this time. So
You could, I think it's regex at the time was superior to all else, but that's the only thing I ever used it for.
yeah, but that's kind of like saying, yeah, the pollution on this planet was better than anybody else's. I mean,
Right.
you know, you start with a problem, you apply regex, now you have two problems. I mean,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, that's funny.
so
So as you were going through your career, what were some of the decisions for moving around? You know, was it pay related? Was it new experiences?
a lot of it was, you know, kind of opportunistic, right? The first job that I did with Mike, you know, that opened some doors. I had done some work with Intuit, and then, you know, that was down in the Bay Area. I was living in Davis, and you know, near Sacramento at the time. And when I started working for Mike, you know, that sort of put me on the radar of several contracting companies in town. So now, you know, work with them to find contract. Because at the time, you know, mid 90s, it was a very, very contract friendly. You could make some really decent money just contracting, slinging code, and so forth. By the end of the 90s, though, Mike had actually, and a couple of other developers at his company, they had a contract to publish a book on Delphi. And talking with Mike about writing a book was like, oh, this doesn't seem all that unapproachable. And when Manning Publications was looking for somebody to write a book, or in my case, two books on OWL, you know, wasn't that hard to take that leap, because I worked with people who have, and being an international relations major, we used to write a 5-page paper as a homework assignment. So
Right.
how much more work can a 450-page book be, right? And so that was one opportunity. The publisher then came back to me and said, hey, by the way, we've got this Java book under contract, but the author has ghosted. You know, are you interested in being the knight on a white horse here? And I'm like, yeah, Java seems interesting. You know, I've been poking around with it, and the language seemed utterly simplistic, which it was compared to C++, but the virtual machine, once I started seeing what the virtual machine had done and what kind of power it afforded us at runtime, I mean, just the ability to reflect, the ability to look at a type and be able to pick out the fields. And I was just like, my God, this is amazing. Because, you know, even though I had done a little bit with Lisp and a little bit with some other, you know, runtime based languages in college, never really done any sort of deep dive. And so once I discovered this in Java, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many options, so many opportunities here. This is amazing. So I did server-based Java, right? Again, because the opportunity kind of presented itself. And then about a year after that, there was an ad in the back page of a printed periodical. Yes, kids, there was a time when companies would put want ads in the back of these printed periodicals, because there was no monster.com, there was no Dice, there was no, you know, LinkedIn, right? And it was for a company called Develop Mentor, who was looking for Java instructors. And if you are, you know, if you got enough gray in your hair, you know the Develop Mentor name, because this was the company of Don Box, right? This was the company that had made their name around COM and the Microsoft technology stack. And I had always admired them from afar. And I thought, you know, what the hell? Why not? Right? Let's just, you know, throw my name in the hat and talk to the recruiter, Peg. And she's like, okay, well, we're going to have one of our instructors give you a call and do a tech screen. I'm like, okay, let's do that. And I remember it very vividly, because I'm in my kitchen waiting for the landline to ring, because this was before we had cell phones, kids.
Right.
And Owen, you know, calls me, hey there, my name's Owen Tallman. I'm here to do a tech screen for you for Develop Mentor. I said, let's go. He's like, okay, so do you feel comfortable with RMI, which was the Java remoting technology? And I said, yeah, I'm, you know, familiar with it. He's like, okay, well, in RMI, we actually generate the stubs and proxies off of a given implementation, whereas in Corba, we do so off of the interface definitions. What implications does that have for object identity and distributed object scenarios? And I went, oh,
That's a great question.
well, oh my gosh, I have never felt so wrung out
Mm.
after a tech screen as I did after this one. And we went for about an hour, and then, I was supposed to wait for a few minutes so Owen could call Peg with his feedback. And so I waited about 15 minutes, maybe it was 20, I don't know, called Peg, and she says, hello. I said, Peg, this is Ted. And the first thing I want to say is, I'm so sorry for wasting your time. And she's like, no, actually, I just got off the phone with Owen. He thought you did great. We want to bring you down to LA for a test teach. And I swear, for a full 10 seconds, I couldn't say anything. And then the first thing out of my mouth was, did we talk to the same Owen? But, I didn't try to BS my way through any answer. I admitted what I didn't know. And, Peg said, Owen basically reached for his A game material and you didn't flinch. So yeah, come on down. Let's do a test teach.
Nice.
And Developmentor was absolutely one of the best things that could ever happen to me. When the company folded, I don't know, like 4, 5, 6 years ago. I mean, it was the passing of an era for me, because there were so many amazing instructors. I learned so much from being a part of that crew. And it was really a beautiful example of, I think Chad Fowler talks about it in one of his books, be the worst band member in any band you're in. Be the dumbest person in the room is the way I would generalize it, because it elevates your game to have to try to keep up with those folks and to have to try to understand where they're going, and just you osmose all of this stuff. And then similarly, about 5 years after I started teaching for DM, there was an opportunity to get involved in a Java conference series. It's literally a rock tour of Java speakers called No Fluff, Just Stuff. And it was the same kind of thing. Some of the brightest folks I have ever met, we did 25 to 30 shows per year in various cities all over the United States.
Oh, wow.
And, it was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday conference, very, very prescient to a lot of the code camps that we have today. Speakers would fly in, typically we'd fly in Thursday night or Friday morning, but, Friday night it was a keynote, Saturday night speaker dinner, Sunday night, usually everybody's trying to go home at that point. But those Friday and Saturday nights, speakers would get together, we'd have dinner, and we would talk shop and we would tell fart jokes. It was just that kind of a camaraderie. And holy crap, I learned so much, so many things that would be hard to Google, really. And something like 3/4 of the Java champions in the world are all no fluff speakers, and many of these folks have gone on to do other things in other technology spaces. It's, again, I didn't set out to be a part of that, but the opportunity was there. Yeah. And about 10 years ago, it was really the first deliberate decision point, which was, my career goal has always been to be a CTO somewhere. And to do that, you really kind of need to prove to people that you can, build and manage and run a team successfully. Mm-hmm. So it's time to start doing some of that. So I kind of hung up my architect/developer spikes and moved into, first a startup with a couple other folks building a consulting company here in town. And then I went to go work for a larger startup, Smartsheet, which is one of the billion-dollar unicorns. And then, moved over to Rocket Mortgage, which was a 30,000 person company, So each of those was, can I show that I can build and run teams in successively larger companies? Because there's really not a lot of companies, except for the really big boys, right? Microsoft, Google, et cetera. Not a lot of companies that are larger than 5 digits. So if you can survive in a 5-digit company, you can probably survive anywhere. That's really the first hard decision point that wasn't driven entirely by opportunistic opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that is a big decision, right? The day you decide, I want to move from being the guy on the keyboard doing the coding to managing a team. I remember that transition. I had to put up on a whiteboard to remind myself, tell them what, not how, right? Like you said early, there's so many ways to do things. And if you manage people and you're telling them what to do, they're like, why do you need me if you can just going to tell me what to do, right? Yeah. Let me use my own creativity.
Yeah. And corollary to that is, in some cases, you have to let them try and fail, right? Because one of the things I think that, when a developer becomes a manager, you have an intrinsic sense of you are no longer being measured by your ability as a developer. It's not just being the smartest person in the room anymore. Now, as manager, the measurement of your success is very much the measurement of the team's success.
Yeah.
And so there's this underlying sense of you better make sure that, your team doesn't screw it up. But to do that, well, you have to let the team do it.
Right.
And there are a lot of very good ICs, individual contributors, who get to that point where it's like, oh yeah, the team's going to do this, and I don't think they're doing it right, or they run into a difficulty, they run into a problem, and the temptation is just, let me go to the keyboard and let me just do this, let me just fix this, let me just do this. In the same way, that as a parent, you have this tendency to say, oh, you're not tying your shoes right, let me tie your shoes for you. You can, but if you don't let the kid learn how to tie their own shoes, are you going to be tying their shoes for the rest of their lives, right? You really have to get comfortable with the idea of letting your team do things and fail so that they can learn, so that they don't fail anymore. And that's a very, very hard thing to do. It's hard to let go. It really is.
Yeah. So as you've gone through your career and you've had a great many opportunities and interesting stops along the way, what's something that you've seen that we do within our IT space that you just wish we did it differently? And if we came to you, Ted, and said, Ted, you have the power today to make us reconsider that, what might that be for you?
There's really two answers, and one of them is really a mindset, but the other is more of a practice, right? So the second one is a little bit more in keeping with your question, but the first one, I really wish I could reset the technology industry's hubris. There is a ton of hubris, and frankly, I mean, it's playing itself out on a global stage right now with Elon buying Twitter, right? So many developers have looked at Twitter and said, I could build that in a weekend. And Elon thought, oh, yeah, how complicated is this site, right? It's just a collection of messages. I mean, it's just one big ass database, right? I mean, how hard could it be? And Elon is finding out how hard it really is.
Yeah.
And lots of people, as a result, are losing a very, very useful utility. But that's a different discussion for a different day. The hubris that I see in the technology space, particularly when you talk to developers and you ask them a question, their response is, oh, well, it's just, and those two words right there, it's just, are usually a red flag that go off in my head, because, oh yeah, it's just doing this and it's just doing that. And no, it's not. Many people do these things for very good reasons, and you really should. I've seen it as a consultant, right? I come in and, I'm part of a consulting team, or I'm asked to do a due diligence on what a consulting group built. And, well, the previous folks who were here, they built this and it's all a mess, so we have to start over. Because when we do it, it's not going to be a mess, because even though we've only been looking at this problem for maybe a week and the other team had been wrestling with it for a year and a half, we can do this better than whoever that was that just left, right? Hubris is rampant, and it's not uncommon amongst industries that consist of very smart people. Doctors and lawyers, the hubris runs rampant there. We won't even talk about politicians, because most people don't think of politicians as being very smart. I disagree, but that's a different discussion. If I could get people to back away from I'm a very smart person and therefore I'm very smart about everything, right? That, I think, would be the biggest win that our industry could ever achieve. But given that that's not going to happen, the practical thing, very bluntly, that I wish we would do differently, interviewing and hiring, because right now, I've been a hiring manager. I've been on the opposite side of the table for a lot. And frankly, it's broken in our industry. It's just flat out broken. We've got too many people who really don't know what they're doing these interviews. And unfortunately, you can't tell them they're doing it wrong, because in many cases, when they refuse to hire somebody because they don't tick off all the check boxes, it's a false negative, right? Basically, right. Oh yeah, that person, they're not hardcore enough to work here, right? Or they're not a culture fit, or they don't have those skills, or yeah. And so therefore you don't see the mistake. You don't feel the pain of the mistake, particularly because everybody knows that one bad hire, right? I mean, you hear that so often when you talk to HR department. One bad hire and the whole thing. What we're gonna hire one person and all of the company is going to go. Unless that person is a $44 billion billionaire who comes in as CEO and promptly decides to screw everything up, and that's more at your level than mine, right? Let's just call that spade out right now. You hire a developer and it turns out they don't have the skill set that you thought they did. There's ways to fix that. There's ways to adjust for that, particularly in a large company. Yeah. Right. Company like Microsoft or Rocket Mortgage or Google or Ford or any of these places, but because there's that myth, we tend to set up all these gates that people have to go through. And if they don't hit every one of them, and then we set very, very vague goals, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, you need to know, we're looking for somebody to build our website, but you need to have 10 years of Elixir experience and 20 years of CSS, and you better have 50 years of Agile, right? Oh, and by the way, it's an internship, and, you'll be doing it for free. Right. Interviewing is basically a bet. Mm-hmm. And there's a really good book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. She's a World Series of poker player, and she talks about how to make decisions when you don't have perfect information, which is exactly what most decisions are, right? And so part of what you're trying to do is, when you're an interviewing manager, you're trying to figure out, is this a safe bet? Not, is this a guaranteed good hire? Mm-hmm. And that the difference between those 2 points, huge. That's the core of this thing, right? I've made some very interesting bets with the people that I've hired, and quite frankly, I've been somewhat lucky, but also somewhat good in the fact that they've panned out. They've done very, very well. And in many cases, these were not people that would have gotten hired for the same role if somebody else were leading the team. Mm. But that's okay, because, I mean, as a manager of the team, you have to be comfortable with it. But if we talk about hiring diverse teams, it's not just about, the color of their skin or their cultural background. It really is the difference of perspective that they bring. There was a DevRel team that was, that actually a buddy of mine was working for me, built out at Rocket Mortgage. And we hired a marketing intern to be a part of that team, even though she had zero programming knowledge, because the team needed kind of a marketing eye to be able to get out and get in front of developers and whatnot. And she was solid. I mean, she really became one of the strong assets to the team. Hiring is broken in our industry right now. Too many engineering managers are saying, well, you got to have X number of years, and I've got to see you be able to do X number of CS problems and go to the whiteboard or do the virtual whiteboard. Look, I'm absolutely a fan of the coding test, but make the test be as close to the real world scenario as possible. Let people take it home, let them do it at their own time, give them more work than they can finish, and tell them that up front, that I don't expect you to finish all of this because I'd like to see kind of how you approach the problem. Do you do it in a TDD style? Do you write your tests after the fact? Did you even write tests? Yeah, right. Yeah. And being transparent about it. These are the things we're looking for. This is the rubric against which you're going to be evaluated. Having a rubric, right?
That's a big deal. Yeah.
Well, and I'll close with this particular rant. Everybody will talk about, hey, we want to hire programmers who write good code. Great. What is good code? Just answer that question for me. What is good code? Tell me what the definition of good code is. And it's fascinating when you do this in a group, right? Particularly if it's all Java developers or all C# developers. You'd think that we would have some sort of agreement on what good code constitutes, and it gets off the rails really fast, which then tells me we don't really know what good code is. So if you don't know what good code is, how can you tell if this person's writing it?
Right.
Right.
Wow. That's such an excellent point. Yeah, it's like saying there's only one JavaScript framework that's going to work. No, that's not how that works.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I've advocated, I haven't yet found a company that's willing to take me up on it, but one of the things that I've advocated is the idea that we should be unit testing our interview processes the same way we do our code. So in other words, if you believe that your process is a good one and will actually give you a semi-objective assessment of somebody's skill set, prove it. Let me take somebody that, we know is very good, right? Let's grab one of the industry icons, that we may see at a conference. We'll pay them for their time, but let's have them submit a resume under a different name and run them through the process, and let's see if we give them an offer, right? In other words, take a known set of data and run it through the process to see what we get out on the other end. Because I would be willing to bet that in many cases, if you didn't know who Anders Hallsberg was and he tried to interview for a role at your company, there's a very strong chance that somebody would say, yeah, he doesn't really have the experience we're looking for. He doesn't really have the background. I really don't think he's a senior engineer. I think he's really just a mid-level engineer. Really?
Right.
Yeah, your process is broken. It's not Anders.
Yeah,
right?
It would be broken. Yeah.
Because we talk about unit testing. We talk about taking our code and putting it through known inputs in order to make sure we get the right outputs. But then when we get to some of our human processes, there's no way to test that. I call bullshit on that. I really do.
Yeah, there's always a way.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So what's next for you? What's coming up in the near future?
Well, that's a very good question to which I don't have an answer. I currently at the moment, I am, how shall we say, between engagements. 2022 has been an interesting year. I left Rocket Mortgage at the beginning of 22 and been kind of looking at a couple of different things. And for one reason or another, they've all kind of fallen apart. So technically I'm employable. I'm looking to stay in kind of the management space, the senior management space, director, VP, something like that. Would love to be a CTO somewhere. CTO of a company larger than one. That's a goal.
Right.
In either an engineering management space or developer relations space. I'm going to continue speaking at a number of conferences. And as a matter of fact, right before we started here, I was trying to get back into doing some blogging because I really have been kind of bad about that over the last several years. But I've actually got a course in the works with not a Pluralsight course, but an educative course. Educative is kind of like Pluralsight, except instead of doing video, they do prose. So it's written instead of watch the screen and listen kind of thing. And this first course, I'm basically going to do a series of courses on engineering management for the first line and second line managers. I run a team of teams. The first one's on performance management, right? How do I evaluate the people reporting to me? It's going through edit right now. I think it's supposed to be ready by the first of the year, but I'm not positive. We'd have to go look at the website to see. Doing that. And I know I'm going to be at that conference in January down in Texas, and probably going to try to do KCDC and a couple other shows in the US, a couple other shows in Europe. And I don't know who else.
Maybe whoever calls. Whoever calls.
Opportunity. Right? What's that?
And whoever calls.
Like I said, opportunistic, right? Sometimes you throw your hat into the wind and see where it blows, and if it blows someplace interesting, you go with it.
Absolutely. Well, Ted, thank you for coming on the podcast today. It's been a joy to get to know you and hear your philosophy, which definitely is a philosophy, and I agree with you heavily. And just thank you for this conversation.
Thanks for having me, and hopefully we get to do it again sometime.